Hey, y'all. So we are now looking at part two, the apartheid and its opposition. So what we're going to do, this lesson, we're going to focus on the developments from 1910 all the way to 1955, give or take. Okay. So as we look at this, we've talked about how the Union of South Africa was formed. We talked about we go from class distinction to race distinction. And now as we look, we're going to see the birth of segregation in British South Africa. I do want to emphasize British South Africa. It is still part of the British Commonwealth. The British monarch still has authority over this, but the Afrikaner government the Afrikaners control the South African Parliament. And just to kind of remind us where we've been in the midst of the social Darwinism and eugenics, the British government conspired with the Afrikaners to segregate the economic and political realms. Really important there. It's all about disenfranchisement, both economically and politically. By reducing access to political and economic power of the Africans, the Afrikaners and the British were able to truly exploit labor, wealth, and other elements. So it's a very significant, very significant. So there are three parts that I want to focus on. The first thing is that from the 1880s to the 1920s, we have a series of passed laws, and the South African officials worried about the movement of natives. And this, again, you see that in quotations, the idea that these natives are savages, can't be trusted, unsophisticated. And this becomes the justification for them to pass these pass laws. And pass laws created the pass books, as you see an example of one right there. And those pass books were, Africans were forced to carry it to justify their location. So their presence was going to be justified by the records, the recorded history of their movements on these passbooks. So if an African moved into a certain area, they would have to get that documented in their passbook so that if they're found in that area, they would be seen as justified. Really important here. Something we don't have to write about, Natives Urban Aryans Act of 1923. This is the escalation. Not that we're ever going to be tested on this right now. But again, any African man without a pass in an urban area would be arrested and sent into those rural areas or the native reserves. Really important. Again, it's about controlling the movement of Africans. These pass laws really dehumanize Africans as their presence was only justified by a book. Also, the Mines and Works Act of 1911. This is the first key segregation act. Created a color bar, and that color bar is where skilled labor was reserved for the whites only. Unskilled labor was reserved for Africans. So this color bar is that invisible ceiling that kept Africans from gaining wealth. They had no access. It didn't matter what their skill level was or what their experience. They were denied access to the more skilled labor because of this color bar that is established by the Mines and Work Act, which guaranteed there would be no generational wealth secured by the Africans. This will be amended several times. By the 1950s, mining work became a national interest. So if Africans attempted to strike, they'd be immediately considered communist and thrown in jail. So now we see this economic disenfranchisement. They have lack of opportunities. And again, they're controlled. This is going to be followed by the Natives Land Act. The Natives Land Act, this is key economic and social segregation. Economically, it prevented Africans from owning key arable land. This is actually still something that's discussed today about Afrikaners, land redistribution, fears. All of these things are kind of rooted here because so now socially, it did not allow Africans to belong to the urban areas. So Africans could not own land, and they were not allowed to reside or home ownership in Cape Town and Johannesburg. So what happened to those Africans who had owned property? It's going to be stripped away from them. So now all of a sudden, not only are they losing generational wealth, they don't even have an ability to maintain home ownership. Very significant. And maybe most importantly, 80% of the population, which were African, are going to be reserved in those 7% of the land. So you see those darkened areas; those are considered the native reserves. And we see that area again, thinking about that, think about how all that is. So now all of a sudden we see this segregated South Africa. By the mid 1920s, Afrikaners and British held special economic, political, and social privileges. This mirrored the racial policies of Jim Crow in the American South. And the Africans became more and more frustrated with these artificial barriers. Of course, they weren't excited about being part of the Union of South Africa, as they were not granted any of the benefits of belonging. Well, in the midst of all this, there is going to be early resistance. The first group we're going to talk about is the SAIC. This is going to be formed by Mahatma Gandhi in 1894 in reaction to the segregation laws. He personally faced some segregation. He was kicked off a train, and this was when he began to realize that his dark skin determined his place in the society. So he decided it was time for them to protest. Here we see this concept of satagara, which is the idea of pursuit of truth. This truth was the center of Gandhi's activism, and really he organized his nonviolence based on this principle. And he taught that this truth was worth suffering prison and other consequences, that this truth is greater than the oppression. So we begin to see this element. This becomes the foundation for the African protests. On the other side, we got the African National Congress, the ANC. In 1912, a group of wealthy Cape Town Africans formed this ANC to negotiate rights with the British government. I think it's really important. It's all about wealthy and it's about rights. The way the African National Congress viewed society, they saw it through class distinctions as it had previously been done before the Boer War, rather than racial escalation. So what they're seeing in the world is very different, and it's not going to be an all-inclusive group for Africans. It's going to be about class distinction. They represented primarily middle-class values. They're embracing the idea of propriety, believed if they had embraced propriety as lawyers, doctors, and others, then they would be brought to the table, that they would have earned their position. They embraced Gandhi's passive resistance. But the significant change in 1912 was the ANC wanted to put the ethnic differences aside. They did not want to see each other as chiefdoms and divided by different groups. They don't want to be seen as the Xhosa or the Zulus. They want to be seen as a singular African people. But once again, they did not want to bring in the fold the poor. They were looking at propriety, earning their position, and negotiating. So now we see these areas of protest, and now we're going to jump all the way to the 1940s with the Second World War. As the Second World War occurred, South Africa was a British dominion. So it's going to join the Allies despite a push against that. Many of the more reactionary conservative Afrikaners opposed the Allies as they believed they held the similar racial views as the Nazis. Here we see this is the most extreme group here, and you see they're about to give the Nazi salute. So they're protesting, but despite the Afrikaners' protest against the war, they're going to see their sons recruited. The reactionary Afrikaners are going to shift away from supporting the United Party, and they're going to support the National Party. The National Party is really emerging here, re-emerging from kind of dormancy, if you will, for a minute. And they're like, hey, we are Afrikaners. We want this. So as the Afrikaners are being impacted by the wars, their sons are being either recruited or drafted, they're like, hey, we're fighting the wrong country. And really they begin to question their belonging to the Dominion. And as the Second World War also, as it seemingly negatively impacted the Afrikaners, it is going to serve seen as a turning point in race relations. As the military draft was drafting many of the Afrikaners, South Africa was in desperate need of semi-skilled and skilled labor. The South African government weakened the pass laws, allowing for the free migration of Africans into the city. This is so important. By softening those pass laws, They were no longer recording movement of Africans. So during World War II, there's going to be a significant urbanization of Africans into Johannesburg because of the need for semi-skilled and skilled labor. They're not going to be recorded. And remember, those passbooks are the justifications. We'll see why that's important a little bit later. The African laborers began to realize that they held value as they provided for the cause of war. They supported the war. They supported South Africa. So they saw their means of living really increase. But by the time we get to 1946, as the Afrikaner troops were coming home, we began to see a systematic removal of Africans from leadership position. And this created the element of the miners' strike. The 1946 miners' strike is a significant turning point in this, more significant than even World War II, because as the Africans began, they thought this was their moment to protest this movement away from their labor, protest against movement away from their skill. And they said, enough's enough. Here we see a 40th anniversary text. We see clear communism elements. And this is where the National Party is really going to synthesize the African protest movement with communism. Yes, communists were part of the miners' union as the miners struck. Instead of being perceived as a racial element, the Afrikaner government is going to push it as as a communist aspect. And that begins to change the narrative. And this leads right to the election of 1948. Sometimes we call this the apartheid election. Albert Lutuli actually laughed when this was asked of him in the early 1960s and said, really, what was the difference? So again, kind of an interesting element. But for our class, we are going to identify it as the apartheid election because there is a distinct change in the Constitution. The National Party really reemerged out of dormancy. They really played on mass politics. Here we see a wonderful illustration of mass politics. When I say wonderful, not nice, but really nasty. But it really shows us the choice before the country. Are they going to allow the double-headed monster of blackness and communist push them into the ravine of chaos? This would be utilized to really strike the emotions, and they preach two things. First thing, black peril. The idea that if we don't make changes, the Africans are going to overwhelm us. Therefore, they're going to take our daughters. They're going to miscegenate. They're going to do all these terrible things, and we're going to lose our way of life. Then, not only was it racial, they also used the idea of red peril, the idea that we are fighting a fight, not just against the Africans and their savagery, but the communists themselves, their godlessness. When they combine this, absolute is really a significant moment, and it really motivated the rural Afrikaners to vote for the National Party. In the election of 1948, here we see the National Party gain 70 seats versus 65. So the United Party is going to lose its position. But I also want to call attention to the actual percentage of votes. This election wasn't really that close. And yet, the loser of the popular vote won enough seats. This was an electoral victory in which the National Party focused on seats they could win. And in 1948, 38% of the population will determine the future of South Africa. And this really leads us to the implementation of apartheid. When we look at this apartheid, we see the development. There's a fear of miscegenation. Miscegenation is the fear of mixed race mixing. The idea that white people and black people mix together, social Darwinism, totally bad. And they passed. And again, I almost see that the National Party, I think they were kind of surprised at their victory. I think they were utilizing this and they're like, crap, what do we do? Well, the next year, they passed the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act. And in 1949, all mixed marriages were canceled. So here we see a pretty famous image of a African and Afrikaner who've been married. Well, their marriage, despite how old they are, despite how many children they have, and despite how many years they've been married, they are no longer married. That law was canceled out, their history. And the whole hope was to separate the races so that they could maintain a sense of white supremacy. Well, they began to talk about, oh, we need to make sure we pass this. And they passed the Immorality Act. And the Immorality Act was a law that basically said any African found having sex with a Afrikaner would be considered guilty of a crime, and they'll be sent to law. If you want to pause here and read this really weird newspaper article, you can actually see this idea of what we're seeing. So now all of a sudden, it's not just prohibited; it's also seen as immoral. So as we kind of move it through this, we call these laws petty apartheid because they were meant to do like the day to day life. How can we control them? But they began to realize, the National Party began to realize that petty apartheid, they needed something more grand. They need something more constitutional. And that's when we see the birth of grand apartheid. Grand apartheid is the systemic separation of the races based on the constitutional law. And the first thing we see that gives birth is the Population Registration Act. Because one of the things is, how do we know who are black, who are white, who are colored? How do we know these things? So people were forced to register their population grouping, their race. And this is a really tense moment because people who were colored, if they didn't look colored, if they looked African, they wouldn't pass a such called skin test. So they had to go find documentation to justify their definition of race. And the onus was not on the government, but on the individual to provide this. Because once your group was registered, your racial group, it was not going to change. Well, and not only is it just being populated in registration, we then see the application of the Group Areas Act. And the Group Areas Act really divided the native reserves into the different tribes. You see these Bantustas that will happen in 1959, but it was to help us understand that now all of a sudden they're going to separate the geographic areas so that Africans are not just seen as Africans, the Africans are going to be seen, identified by these different groupings. So this is all about divide and conquering. This divide and conquering by 1959 really helped the National Party divide the Africans into multiple tribes, causing the hope of African unity to really dissipate. Grand apartheid is this really nasty element that really is constitutional, changes the entire essence of the segregation system, making it a very cemented element that's going to take drastic measures to eradicate. In addition to that, we see the Suppression of Communism Act. And this is one of those things that it plays into the Cold War, really significant. The international discussions were against apartheid. The United Nations actually began to, during this time period, especially with India being part of it, really began to push to discuss these things. So what the National Party did is, in the face of international criticism, they passed the Suppression of Communism Act. And this is all about playing in that Cold War, the Red Peril, justification, and it really defined any type of protest as communist. And in some ways, blackness became guilty of communist. And we see this image, is this tomorrow, the idea that the communists are going to take away our church, take away our beings, take away our racial purity. And that's one of those elements that we begin to see. But in addition to that, we begin to see really probably the worst of the laws. The Natives Abolition of Passes and Coordination of Documents Act of 1952. Sometimes we just call it the Abolition of Passes Act. But this is really dates back. All of the former documentation was consolidated into a new passbook. So Africans had to collect all of their documentation, go to a new passbook office, and then as the passbook office would then go through it, they would then create the documentation. I want to remind you, you got to make sure you realize during World War II, the Africans moved into cities without documentation. So now all of that movement is now seen as not legitimate. So now all of a sudden the Africans were illegitimately in those cities. And now with this coordination of this new document, this new idea of what a passbook was, really modernized it, and really Africans lost their justification. Now they're going to be forced into other areas. We're going to talk about that in a second. Now, the last of the key laws I need you to know is the Bantu Education Act. African children were, this was passed by the South African government to protect the educational system, so called. We saw that. And if you saw the Prime Minister Verwoerd, he actually has a really nasty quote here, talking about the abilities of the African. But African children were only taught practical skills that fit the African skill sets. All African education ceased to exist past elementary school. All upper level maths, any sciences, all these things that were seen as social Darwinists outside of their capabilities are erased. And look what Verwoerd said. What is the use of teaching a Bantu child mathematics when it cannot use it in practice? Again, look at the word it, referring to a child as it, dehumanization. This Verwoerd is sometimes identified as the architect of grand apartheid. Bantu education of 1953, right along with the abolition of Passes Act, those two things are seen as the turning point, the crutch of the entire educational system, of the entire system. Look at this image. Does that seem like a class you want to be part of? It's not comfortable. There's not enough seats. There's no resources. This was the future. And in all of this, we begin to see Africans that were in the urban areas are going to be relegated into townships. So if they were not if they were not able to get to the Bantustan, but we'll see later, they're going to be in townships. Townships were communities on the outskirts of the city that were formed, allowing Africans to live closer to their jobs. Here's some images. Townships were undeveloped land that was dominated by poverty. This image in the top is considered a middle class township. They lacked sewer systems, clean water. This is where Africans were relegated to if they were not in their group area. And these townships are going to be called Soweto, which are outside. Soweto is one of the most important townships that are outside Johannesburg. But think about lifespans, access to health care. This apartheid system separated everything by race. And that's going to lead us to the 1950s protest movement. But I do want to pause here. We're going to look at a couple things here in class, but I want you to pause here and think about this systematic approach of establishing a systemic racist system such as apartheid through these laws that relegated Africans to subhuman aspects. Very important, and we'll talk more about this later. Peace.